What is going on, guys? Chaz here today, and I'm going to be doing another speed comparison of the iPod Touch 4th generation and the iPhone 4 on iOS 6 versus on iOS 7. But this time I'm going to be using the iOS 6 compatible versions of the apps on this iPhone running iOS 7, so we get a more fairer comparison, and I won't be testing out any of the stock apps like Clock or anything. I'll only be testing out third-party apps, but they're running on exactly the same versions on both devices. I managed this by extracting the IPAs of the iOS 6 compatible versions on this device and then installing them on this device. I did try to use a tethered downgrade to iOS 6 on this device, but it failed overall and it just wasn't a very easy thing to do, so I ended up just staying on iOS 7 on this, but I'm still going to use the iOS 6 versions of the apps to get a fairer comparison. Even if it's not the most accurate comparison, it will still be a fairer one. So let's get into today's video. So guys, the first app I'm going to test is Opera Mini, which as you can see is the same version on both. I'm just going to check there are no apps running in the background. Alright, of course for photos. Let's quickly get rid of that in the background. And now let's do Opera Mini. I hope I won't do any of those mistakes like I did in yesterday's video. Like where I'd accidentally click on it on one device before on the other. So let's try launching Opera Mini. 3, 2, 1. The iPod Touch loaded that one faster. Let's now try going to Google. 3, 2, 1. Alright, the iPod was a little faster there. Of course, it didn't take much longer for the iPhone to load it, but honestly, in this case, the iPod is faster. Alright, now we're going to be trying media apps. So, as you can see, these are older icons, as these are the iOS 6 compatible versions. They are the same versions on both devices, as I said earlier. So, the only difference really will be the extra RAM on this device and the fact that this device is an extra iOS version higher, but the processor is the same. But we're going to be seeing the difference in speed between these two devices on a different iOS version and with more RAM on this one. So 3, 2, 1. The iPhone was a little bit faster there. Honestly, it wasn't all that faster, but it was a little bit faster there. And as this is the iOS 6 version, that shows that this can be faster on iOS 7 than this can be on iOS 6. Now let's try Spotify. 3, 2, 1. Alright, it does take a little bit of time to load. As you can see here, it's loaded more quickly on the iPhone 4, a lot more quickly on the iPhone 4 than on the iPod. I haven't signed in yet on the iPhone on this version, but I have signed in this version, so it's a little bit different. But it did definitely load a lot faster on the iPhone 4 than on the iPod. Now let's try VLC. 3, 2, 1. The iPhone 4 was a few seconds faster there. And as you can see, even though the app's user interface looks different, they're actually still the same versions. This app looks a little bit more modern, but it obviously was made. This version of the app was made when iOS 7 was around, but the app version would still work on iOS 6, so it's still an older design and look on iOS 6. Right. Now, guys, let's try the games. I've got 2 games here, and Twist has always been the same version on both. because they both run at least iOS 6, and Twist requires iOS 6 and later. Even on the current version, it hasn't been updated in like ages, as you can tell. There aren't any apps that have been updated like since 2017 that still work on iOS 6. So this app hasn't been updated in a while, but it requires iOS 6 and later, even on the current version. So honestly, there's no real need to install the IPA, but I did actually install the IPA from this iPod onto this iPhone. For some reason, I forgot it required iOS 6 or later anyway, so there wasn't really any need. But let's try Twist. 3, 2, 1. Alright, it does take a while to load on both devices because they've obviously got an old processor. Alright, this loaded on the iPhone 4 faster. And the iPod is still loading, a bit like with Spotify. Alright, finally it's loaded. On both. I'm not going to bother playing any of it because it's going to be quite hard to play it at the same time on two different devices. 3, 2, 1. iPhone 4 seems to be faster. It's loading it quicker. It's actually loading it quicker than last time. They loaded it at about the same speed last time. So it clearly shows that the iOS 6 version runs better on the iPhone 4 to the iOS 7 version. So the iPhone 4 was obviously noticeably faster there. And anyways guys, I'm not going to test any stock apps because I want this to be as a fair comparison as I can do, and stock apps are obviously on different versions here. So I can't test things like clock because there are going to be differences in the iOS version and the app version. But with all these apps that I've tested, they're all on the same version on both devices. So it'll be unfair to like launch clock and see which one launches faster because they're both on different iOS versions and different app versions anyway. So far, I've seen that the 512 megabytes of RAM on the iPhone 4 really is making a difference here, and it's been loading apps like several seconds faster in some cases than on the iPod, and it clearly shows the iOS 6 versions are more optimized for older devices than the iOS 7 versions of the app, as the iPhone 4 definitely ran the apps much quicker, or just slightly quicker even than the iPod Touch, but it clearly shows that the iOS 6 versions of the app are more optimized than the versions of the app for iOS 7 and later. Honestly guys, I found this comparison much more interesting than the previous one, and it clearly shows that the app developers have optimized their apps for older hardware when iOS 6 was the latest version available, or even when iOS 7 had just been released. And they were still making apps that supported iOS 6 that ran much better than the apps that required iOS 7, the future versions of those apps. Anyways guys, I did hope you enjoyed that video. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment on your opinion on how these apps are running and how much better iOS 6 is than iOS 7. Honestly, it's much better, especially on older hardware. Like, I would love to downgrade like my iPhone 5 to iOS 6. You can actually downgrade iPhone 4Ss to iOS 6. So if you have a 4S and you want to like do a comparison against an iPod Touch 5th generation, on iOS 9.3.5 versus iOS 6 or iOS 8.4.1 or whatever, then it's much easier to do so because the iPhone 4S, iPad 2 and iPad 3 are downgradable to iOS 6.1.3. Although FaceTime will be broken, it's definitely good to get some nostalgia. I did hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time. and goodbye.